How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be talking about The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. This is something you're going to want to read if you want to understand why you can't be happy all the time. So, like I mentioned, this is going to be a review of The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. Start off with, this book is best for those who are interested in happiness, particularly those who are interested in ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy. It's also going to be good for those who want to follow a well-established and clinically validated set of principles around improving mental health. The difficulty to digest. The Happiness Trap is fairly easy to digest. The concepts are really well described and there's tons of examples, but it can get a little dry at times. So, on to key insights. The Happiness Trap is a book designed to explain ACT, which is a style of therapy that focuses on acceptance and then taking action to improve your life. Harris describes the methodology in a very logical progression, showing first how we can fall into the happiness trap and then how we can escape it. So, in short, we have to basically set realistic expectations around happiness, then take action to improve our lives in a meaningful way. So Harris starts by talking about what is the happiness trap. The happiness trap, in short, is the idea that fighting our emotions and looking to fully control our experience actually produces more misery than simply accepting them. The more tightly we cling to control, the more desperate and pained we become. The loop is underpinned by a number of myths, right? There are a lot of common misunderstandings that get people trapped here. So one example is the idea that people are naturally happy. That's just not true, right? Minds are designed for survival if you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, and for that reason, they are attuned to pay attention to problems and focus on things that could potentially hurt us. We're designed to constantly be on edge, sort of seeking, and not necessarily to be satisfied, because hypothetically, if we were feeling happy all the time, we wouldn't necessarily be motivated or aware enough to pay attention to the things that could hurt us. Another myth is the idea that a good life involves sort of getting rid of all the negative feelings and that we can control our experience well enough to be happy all the time. Control strategies, as they're called in the book, can work in the short term, but they're generally ineffective in the long term. We simply can't control our emotions or eliminate negative emotions altogether. It's just not the way that minds are designed. So if we follow this cycle or this idea of, oh, I've got to get rid of all of these negative emotions, we're going to get more and more frustrated because it's simply not possible. So, for example, drinking alcohol is a control strategy that can help with social anxiety, right? And this may work in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't do anything to resolve the root of the problem. It doesn't provide any skills for coping with anxiety. So it's likely to create dependence on the substance along with a bunch of negative self-talk around, oh, why do I have to drink to socialize? What's wrong with me? It's simply not an effective solution, right? It doesn't solve the core problem and it's not sustainable. Acceptance. So if control doesn't work, what's the alternative? Harris and ACT more largely argue that acceptance is a far more useful strategy than control. When we are hooked into our emotion and the stories that go along with them, it's really hard to see things clearly. But by using a bunch of different strategies, we can accept these emotions without necessarily buying them at face value, right? Not necessarily hooking into them just as they come to our minds. We can accept that they exist without letting them overcome us and without fighting and pushing against them and thinking things like, oh, this isn't how it's supposed to be. So again, it's really important to note that negative emotions are a natural and normal part of the human experience, one that we cannot ever fully escape, right? Understanding that this is the way that the mind works is the foundation to managing experience, which is sort of paradoxical. But this is what we need to know, right? That these negative emotions and feelings and thoughts are going to come to us so that we can use other strategies to sort of accept and move beyond them. The Happiness Trap discusses two powerful sets of tools that fall under the umbrella of diffusion and the umbrella of expansion. Diffusion tools help us get unhooked from sort of the story in our minds and the emotions. So for example, let's say something bad is happening and you have the thought, I should hurt myself. Diffusion helps you move past that by going into ideas that go, okay, this is simply a thought, right? It's not a core impulse that I have to act on. It's not me necessarily. It's not something I have to do. It's simply a thought generated by my mind. So there are activities like repeating the thought in a silly voice that can help people see things more clearly for what they are as just a thought. So there, in this book, there are all kinds of exercises like that to sort of help you break out of this idea that you have to be fused with your thoughts, right? Thoughts are things that simply come up and we can choose to unhook from them. Now, we can unhook from thoughts, but it doesn't necessarily remove the feelings. Expansion tools, on the other hand, allow us to observe our experience by sort of leaning into what's happening instead of trying to change it or wish that it were something that it's not, right? So by breathing and sort of making space for the experience and the sensation, we're less likely to get hooked by the feelings as well, in the same way that we can potentially get distance from the thoughts. We can make space for them instead of really trying to fight them. Harris also describes that events in the mind are simply stories, right? These stories can be reshaped, altered, put down, just basically modified in a bunch of different ways. So one useful frame that you can use is to ask if your thoughts and stories are useful instead of if they're accurate, right? So, for example, if you think something like, I'll never find love, you can ask, is this thought useful rather than, is this thought true? And that can help you move past sort of these thoughts and feelings more quickly and move on to sets of actions or activities that are more likely to produce the outcomes you're looking for. Another important theme or idea in the book is this idea of there's a thinking mind and an observing mind, right? And essentially, there are two different types of thought that occur in your mind. The thinking mind is sort of the one that creates stories and passes judgment and generally tries to make sense of the world, right? When you're sitting there and a thought pops into your head, that's more likely to be sort of this thinking mind. The observing mind is the part of the mind that is simply seeing and processing what's around. So, for example, the observing mind might see something or observe something like the floor is white, whereas the thinking mind might say, the floor doesn't match the wall, right? That white color is off. So in this model, the thinking mind is the one that we have less control over, right? You can think of it like a radio. There are thoughts constantly coming out of the observing mind. You can think of it like a radio, right? There are thoughts constantly coming out of the thinking mind, and you can choose with the observing mind whether or not to tune into these stories or if you believe them or how much attention you want to give them, if you want to repeat them, etc. So as we sort of break these stories open, we can reduce judgment and create more room for the associated feelings. Much of what this book has covered so far is around thinking, right? And understanding how our thoughts shape our experience and how we interact with our experiences in terms of thinking. But life isn't just composed of thoughts, right? There are actual things that have impact in the world. So a lot of the ACT framework is taking action as well, right? In ACT, the actions that are most likely to produce meaningful outcomes need to be tied to values. So in this book, it's important that you are able to figure out your values. Harris describes how that allows you to take action and create meaningful sorts of patterns in your life. The more often that we act in accordance with our values, the more likely we are to feel as though we have a rich and meaningful life. In the book, there's also a bunch of activities that we can do to increase our mindfulness, to make sure we make the most of our opportunities. So there are things very similar to meditation for increasing mindfulness and becoming more present in the surrounding world. And again, when we're more tuned in to what our values are and what's going on in the world and what's going on in our mind, we're more likely to be able to take action that is consistent with the way that we want to live, which is more likely to produce positive feelings as opposed to negative ones. Another important point is, we have certain thoughts and feelings, but they don't necessarily control our actions. We have certain impulses or thoughts that may push us in a certain direction, but overall, we have a lot of sway in how we choose to act. So if we can learn to sort of disambiguate all these things, right? If we can learn to sort of see thoughts and feelings for what they are, we can choose to move our actions in a direction that is tied with our values. These are the things that Harris argues is far more likely to create a full and fulfilling life. In a related note, we have to find those sort of thoughts and feelings that we're able to accept and move through in order to achieve our goals, even if it isn't always a purely positive experience. Final opinion. Overall, the happiness trap is a really useful take on a modality of therapy that's worked wonders for a number of people. even if it's not specifically the flavor that fits you, there's likely a lot of useful concepts that you can take away. It's definitely worth a read if you have an interest in well being and aren't already familiar with the ACT model. At one point, the book mentions that we can always choose our action no matter how strong the emotion is. I think this misses the mark a little bit on how attention works, and I'm probably being a little too harsh on the nuances, but most people will have the experience of feeling an emotion so strongly that they black out or see red or react purely on instinct. At a certain point, emotion can overwhelm our ability to slow down and think rationally and make a weighted decision. These are not common instances, right? These are very rarely the case, but I think most people will have had a situation where there is a high enough sense of stimulation and enough emotion that our attention is so absorbed that we actually aren't taking time to consider our options at all. And again, this may be playing in the margins a little bit, but I just wanted to point out that I don't necessarily think that it's true that we can always consciously choose the action, right? Especially if we haven't developed tools to sort of manage our emotions, we can get to a point where we're not necessarily making a conscious decision. But again, very rare. The book also includes an interesting distinction between thoughts as words and visual imagery as different sensations. I don't necessarily have much to add here, and maybe I missed the mark a little bit, but my personal experience just doesn't map well onto this characterization. Both sorts of experiences or thoughts seem to take a similar mental space without a large enough distinction for me to really see, especially as it's broken out in the book. So just a difference of experience there, or maybe I misunderstood the way that it was supposed to be characterized. One other major piece is the idea that control strategies should be avoided. That's hammered home pretty hard, but then later it says they can be used, but they don't always work. It's kind of hard to follow this explanation, and it seems a little bit ambiguous. I think the point is that control strategies can be useful, but overuse can lead to negative long-term impacts and really negative patterns. So I think the stronger point to take away is that acceptance, diffusion, and expansion are all parts of a complete tool set for living your best life. Onto the applicable content. 1. How often do you struggle against negative emotions? How might you be more accepting of them instead? 2. How can you be less judgmental, especially about yourself and emotions? 3. How might you explore your values more? 4. What is one goal you're working on? How does that goal relate to your values? That's all I've got for this video, so hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of what the happiness trap is and if it's a good fit for you or not. Like I said, overall, I think it's a pretty solid read that will have concepts that a lot of people will find useful, especially if you're not already familiar with the underlying framework. That's all I've got for this video, so as always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, throw them down in the box below. I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com, and if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well, and that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.